Peace to the family. Peace to the family. This is Ikemba Ojore of We Charge Colonialism. Coming with another podcast. Have a special treat today. A brother African scholar, Giles, is going to be joining us talking about the development of African states, or the socio-political evolution of African states. And so I'm excited to have this discourse with him. Actually, he's going to give a presentation going through this history of the evolution of these African states. He'll be joining us in a minute. So while we're waiting for him to join us, I want to ask everybody to make sure that you're subscribed to our channel. This is We Charge Colonialism. Subscribe to our channel, like and share this podcast so we can get more people to join these discussions that we're going to be bringing to you as often and as frequently as possible. We Charge Colonialism, a grassroots think tank, and part of our mission is to raise the consciousness of African people to the relationship that we have with our historical oppressors and exploiters who continue to reap the benefits of African labor throughout the world. And so we want to make sure that African people are very conscious to this social dynamic so that we can take the proper steps to transforming African societies, African lives. I am Ikemba Ojore. This is part of what we do at We Charge Colonialism is these podcast videos where we put out information. You can check us on Saturdays every 10 a.m. Eastern time with our podcast and book club, where we examine several texts. Right now, we're examining Kwame Nkrumah's Conscientism. So we're actually finishing that book up. This will be our last week examining Conscientism by Kwame Nkrumah. So make sure you tune into that this Saturday at 10 a.m. We also, past Sunday, we had a great discussion and book review of Dr. Amerson Wilson's The Falsification of African Consciousness. And that, I want to recommend that you go back and you check that video out. It was, it was a great discussion. Dr. Amerson Wilson, who transitioned in 1995 on January the 14th. Hopefully I got that year right. It was 95 or 94. I believe it was 95. January the 14th. So that date is coming up. And just like we recognize some of the great leaders and heroes like Dr. Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, the Fred Hamptons, and so forth, we want to acknowledge Dr. Amerson Wilson, which many people who in the community really believe that there's something fishy around the death of Dr. Amerson Wilson. There's no hard evidence, but Dr. Amerson Wilson put out some very important work for African people in giving us the blueprint, in his blueprint for Black Power, but also exposing the many tactics or strategies that's used to keep African people in a state of unconsciousness. Because when, as Dr. Amerson Wilson talks about, there's different levels of consciousness. Even when we're asleep, that's a state of consciousness. And, Dr. Wilson's work is an attempt to raise our consciousness so that we can begin to see things around us differently, because we've been put in a state of consciousness that makes us think that the society that we live in isn't as bad as many of us make it out to be. And when you think that way, and then the people who are creating the environment that let me make sure, always do this, want to make sure, okay, we can hear you. I was looking to see, I was like, let me make sure I can be heard. I did check all the mute, make sure that I was off mute. So, but Dr. Amerson Wilson, brother Jabril, who was a part of that discussion, hey, peace, King. He was a part of that discussion. He'll tell you it was very dynamic. But that African, the falsification of African consciousness, I think, is one of the most important works. There's a lot of, I wonder why when we talk about, in the conscious community, I'm gonna call it, quote unquote conscious community, but for all my revolutionaries, conscious Africans who understand the relationship that we had, are people who are fighting for liberation because they understand that we are not fully free. Well, there's no half free, so we're not free, right? And so uh, we usually, look to the Nkrumahs and the France Fanons, and we talk about some of these theoreticians. Um, who else? The Thomas Sakaras, right? But there's not a lot of. I think that there needs to be more emphasis on the work of Dr. Amerson Wilson, the same way we talk about the Fanons and the Nkrumahs. For me, I think even more. He is, one of the. For me, he's the most inspirational, and I think one of the greatest thinkers that we had of the 20th century. Um, and I think that we have to do more to examine his work and to be able to implement what it is that he was telling us in the 20th century. Uh, his last book that was published, "The Blueprint for Black Power," there was definitely books published posthumously, but that book, "The Blueprint for Black Power," he told us that this is a moral, political, economic imperative for the 21st century. He was letting us know that, hey, when the 21st century comes, we need to implement this. And this is something that he wrote his before his demise in the 20th century. So, with that being said, I just think it was very, prophetic for him. He was thinking about prosperity, something that we as Africans need to be thinking about in this struggle, not to give up because we feel like it's, this fight is too overwhelming. There's no way that we can overcome white political and economic domination. There's no way we can overcome white supremacy, right? Because of this, because we've been deluded into thinking that they're so all powerful. We're scared to go against them, like we scared to go against God Himself, which is something that we have to break. We have to break these mental psychological chains that has been placed on us to keep us from breaking ourselves away from the enslavement of African people psychologically, mentally, because if you have the mind, you have the body. So even though the physical chains aren't there, we're still tied to a system of oppression and exploitation. So with that being said, I think like it's very important that we do examine his works as well as the others. It's Dr. John Henry Clark. And these are people that we are going to be bringing to you at We Charge Colonialism. So make sure you visit our website as well, wechargecolonialism.org, wechargecolonialism.org. And while we wait, our guest is going to be joining us in a moment. But while we wait, I do want to play a short clip from Dr. Amerson Wilson. And, when we come back, we'll get started. Again, we're going to have brother African scholar Giles Domkam, who's going to be looking at the socio-political evolution of African states. He'll be going through that history. This dude, he's brilliant. This guy is brilliant. So, I'm excited to be able to have this conversation with them. So I'm just going to pull the video up. Thanks again, everyone, for joining. I'm the host and producer, so of this show. So bear with me. Give me one.
and gentlemen. You got to get used to the idea. You got to get used to the idea if you're going to win your freedom that you're going to be disliked by a lot of people and a lot of ethnic groups. Yeah, you got to get used to living with great tension if you're going to reclaim yourself and reclaim your life. If you're trying to maintain peace and harmony with every other ethnic group, they're going to put conditions on it. You can maintain harmony if you let me buy and sell to all your kids and you never own anything. You can maintain harmony as long as you don't disturb my economic domination. It's just like this anti-Semitism stuff that's got LIB jammed up. Oh yeah. People, at one point it's not a race, it's a religion. At another point it's a race. What's going on here? The thing that you have here, ladies and gentlemen, is a political strategy.
Yes, sir.
And an economic what? Strategy. An instrument of what? Control. A means by which one can control the behavior of others. You can call it religion, ethnicity, anything you want to, but its ultimate reality is that it is used to do what? Control the behavior and perceptions of other people in the interest of the people who belong to that thing. That's all it is. And the first question you ask, and so the thing goes out, you're anti-Semitic. Now, it doesn't matter what you said, whether you told the truth or not the truth, or this or that, has nothing to do with that. Not at all. It has to do, now the next question you're going to ask is, oh, how can I not be anti-Semitic? Don't say this, don't say that, don't do this, don't do that, and then we won't call you what? Anti-Semitic. And so when you're striving to be what? Not anti-Semitic, you then what? Fall under the control of another people. Regardless as to whether they are right or wrong, or regardless of how unfair they are, as soon as you meet the requirements of not being called anti-Semitic, you're under control. And yet here's a people that's less than 3% of the American population, less than 1/10 of 1% of the world's population, who through the use of that term and through the throwing of that accusation can manipulate whole political and economic and social systems. And then they're the first one to tell you that you shouldn't talk in terms of race. And
Hey, can you hear me? I don't know if you're mute. I think on the YouTube.
Hey, I am muted. Me and that mute, man. I swear, we have a terrible relationship.
I think I
But
got you.
appreciate you being here. That was Dr. Amerson
Like
Wilson.
I hear your mouth, but I don't hear the voice. Or I see your mouth move, but I don't see the voice. Or I don't hear the voice.
Oh, you
I don't
can't
know
hear
if
me?
it's.
I hear you, but I think I'm good on my. Yeah, I think you guys can hear me right in the chat, just so that we're.
I think it's. Oh, okay. Wait, talk again.
Peace.
Oh, okay, got you. All right. So yeah, that was a really good intro by Dr. Amos Wilson. He's a legend, one of my favorites. And I'm just really grateful that you gave me a chance to speak to your audience and to the fam, and just to share some of the research that I have about how we got here and where we need to go. So it's my pleasure. And I got a little bit of something prepared. Do you want me to share my screen?
Yeah, we can get right into it, man. I think people are like really, waiting, excited, to hear this presentation. I want to appreciate you being here as well. I've heard you. You're brilliant. I've heard you lay down our history, and I know you have a lot to bring. So I'm going to sit back. This is African scholar brother Giles, who you're the creator of, is this Kamji verse?
Yeah,
Am I pronouncing-
The Kamji verse is my channel, and it's basically a channel that I created just to bring forth a different historical perspective to the brothers and sisters out there. Just because I mean I've been seeing a lot of stuff that's I find really really incorrect, and I've been seeing a lot of information against African-centered scholars like yourself, and to me that's just really not fair. So what I decided to do was create this presentation just to show some of the brothers and sisters a different perspective about what some of the scholars on the continent and the diaspora are doing in order to establish distinct scientific traditions and principles that we can use to analyze our societies.
Right on, right on. And where are you located?
Right now, I'm on the West Coast. I've been on the West Coast for quite some time, but I have moved around. I've been in the South before. I've been on the East Coast before, and I've been abroad before. So I've moved around quite a bit, but the majority of my time is out here on the West Coast.
All right, right on, right on. And so you're going to be getting into African states, man. You mean Africans had states? It wasn't just tribes, small
Oh
tribes.
no. Oh no, absolutely not. We were the first people to create civilizations, and we actually taught or we bequeathed some of our principles to the outside world. So that's what we're going to get into. We're going to get into the socio-political evolution of African states. And I know that a lot of you are familiar with Karl Marx and some of these European philosophers who talk about historical materialism and the transition of different societies from the slave mode of production to feudalism to capitalism, with an intermediary stage being mercantilism. And then we talk about early capitalism versus late stage capitalism. And a lot of brothers and sisters think that these principles established by Europeans are universal. But we have a scholar here by the name of Kwame Nantambu. And Kwame Nantambu has described some principles and iterations for what we now know as Pan-Africanism. And this would be establishing unity in different parameters, whether it's social, economic, political, military. And what he found is that when he was analyzing these historical African civilizations, he saw them moving towards unity and he saw them collaborating on different levels. One of the first iterations was the unification of ancient Kimi. And when I say Kimi, I'm speaking of what we may know as Kemet or ancient Egypt, Kimi being the living language way to say it, under Namur in the 32nd century BCE to the Common Era. So all of the civilizations in pre-colonial Africa in the BC area going back to the BC era going back to the 32nd century would be the first iteration of Pan-Africanism, and or what you could call it more accurately a proto Pan-Africanism. And the evolution continues into the second iteration, and that would be the establishment of Al-Andalus. Would be within that, and that goes from about the first century to the 15th century, where you had the expulsion of the Almoravids from the Iberian Peninsula. And again, within that second iteration, you have African people extending out from the continent into different areas in the diaspora and establishing a variety of unities, in order to extend the political leverage and agency and autonomy of African people within different segments of the world. The third iteration, according to Dr. Kwame Nantambu, would be the resistance against enslavement and the Ma'afa from the 15th to the 19th century, right? And this would be where you would find the greats, like Martin Delany, Edward Wilmot Blyden, Alexander Crummell, Africanus Horton, and some of the main ancestors that we have, Anna Julia Cooper, men and women who are resisting the Ma'afa and enslavement and basically trying to retain some of the social formations and traditions that they had in the first and second iteration. And then obviously the fourth iteration would be the 20th century to the current time, and that would be the intellectual, scientific, and cultural emanation of modern Pan-Africanism, where we're basically trying to reconstruct and, get to the point that where we have complete and total liberation from all types of oppression and white supremacy. And this is kind of the diagram here where you can see what I just laid out a bit. Now, moving on, you have Van Horn out of the University of Wisconsin, and he describes Africology. And what he says is that Africology is the study of the centrality of Africa in the emanation of Homo sapiens sapiens as sentient beings capable of constructing concepts of right and wrong. And these terms are not used here as solely ethical, moral ones. But these concepts of right and wrong, they guide life preserving contra life destroying behaviors that have been and are transmitted transgenerationally, transmillennially, and universally. So what Van Horn does is that he puts Africology within the framework of four interlocking social forces that lead to social formations. So you have the behavioral force, the leadership force, the educational force, and the resource force. And according to his research, these would be the sociocultural themes that our ancient ancestors as Homo sapiens sapiens used to survive and to basically flourish within their ancient environments. And all of these principles are encoded within our genes, and they continue as we move on to the history and the development of further African civilizations. So we have a tradition of Africological analysis in the same way that Europeans they prize Marx and Luxemburg and Lenin and all of the different theorists that they have. We have a variety of theorists such as Antonor Firmin, and he's one of the fathers of Pan-Africanism. He is a Haitian, and he worked very, very closely with brothers and ancestors like the great Martin Delany. And he's the father of African-centered anthropology and linguistics. One of the main things that he argued was against the natural genetic inferiority of African people using a principle that's called positivism, or basically an evidence-based approach. And that's really important because he existed during the time of social classical evolutionists of the 19th century, where they believed that everybody went from matriarchy to patriarchy, from savagery to barbarism to civilization, and that because African societies were not oppressive to women and did not necessarily have the type of violent patriarchal forms, they thought that those were inferior. But Antonor Firmin, along with others like Edward Blyden, were saying, no, we don't have that structure. We have a different element of evolution and development. And Antonor Firmin also contributed greatly to African linguistics in his denial of the validity of so-called Afro-Asiatic, which was back then called Hamido-Semitic and connected to Hamidicism and the Hamidicist theory. And he set the framework for what future scholars like Theophilo Benga and Cheikh Anta Diop would build upon. Now, Diop is a champion of a pluridisciplinary approach in analyzing African history. And what pluridisciplinary basically means is combining different models or combining different approaches and methodologies in linguistics, anthropology, theology, philosophy, architecture, engineering, science, mathematics, etc., to build accurate historical models. So you want to have cross corroboration between different fields in order to get the most accurate information possible. And at the UNESCO Symposium of 1974, Cheikh Anta Diop used that approach to prove definitively that the civilizations of classical Africa and Kenyan Kush were peopled from the inner portion of the African continent, as opposed to the invading pharaonic race theory that was proposed by William Flinders Petrie, and has now been completely debunked with the help of Diop's research. Now, one of his students, Musa Lam, he confirmed the validity of the Diopian migratory model, and he established the spatio-temporal evolution of material cultures on the African continent from the east to the west. So Musa Lam, being of Fulani or Pool heritage, he was basically able to establish that their material culture and society was derived from the Happy River Valley, or the Nile, if we were to use the Arabic term. Ndika Aqua is another associate of Cheikh Anta Diop in Cameroon, a legendary anthropologist and historian, and he established the Mulungi model to analyze what Diop described as the multilineal evolution of African societies. So when I say multilineal, that's not necessarily dealing with the unilineal evolution of those social classical evolutionists, Darwin, Morgan, Tyler, etc., the people who are saying that Africa was primitive because we didn't have a patriarchal or an oppressive form of society. But Dika Aqua, in many different registers, developed the Mulungi model in order to understand the distinct evolutionary parameters and the way that our civilizations developed from antiquity to contemporary times. So these are the elements of what could be called the African mode of production by Cheikh Anta Diop. Again, we've all heard of slavery, feudalism, capitalism. We've heard of these different modes of production that, according to Marx's theory of historical materialism, would be universal. But Sheikh Anta Diop was able to establish some distinct parameters of African economies. And he came up with these five, and these five would be in this text: civilization or barbarism. They would be the collectivization of labor without pay for the purpose of establishing an infrastructurally developed commons. If you are familiar with the Manefer Dam in Kimi, that was built using this system of what's also called corvée labor. And also, if you're familiar with revolutionary Somalia under Siad Barre, when they developed Somalia in a very, very short period of time, they used this model. Another example that I can think of off the top is Thomas Sankara in Upper Volta, which he renamed Burkina Faso. He also used corvée labor as a way of conservation and to invigorate the mode of production of that society against imperialism. What you also have is the collective administration of property based upon a common pool of resources, and we're going to go over that. You have a domestic or a familial economy in rural regions with a centralization of agricultural production. The importance of urban life or the metropole as a focal point of the political economy and what establishes collective identity. And then you also have the privatization of commerce with cultural regulations. And that's more so dealing with what's called the SUSU, or a rotating savings and credit association. So this is going to come from Dika Aqua's research, and this research is dealing with the evolution of these African states, or the African motor production states. What was the typology? How did it get from the protoform to the form that we can observe today, especially in our most esteemed state? So what you first have is the pre-state or the proto-state, and that's a lineage-based ethnarchy. And an ethnarchy is basically a administrative unit that's ruled by a certain ethnic lineage, with the leader or the parent, the father or mother of that lineage at the head. Another example of the proto-state is a ruler of a city quarter. Now, from the proto-state or the pre-state, the evolutionary forces change and it becomes a territorial state. And a territorial state is basically a kingdom, nation, or federation. Now, this is distinguished between, or there's a lot of elements that distinguish a territorial state from what's called a city state. And mainly from an African centered perspective, what that would be is basically everybody within a specific territory that's coordinating all of their commerce and all of their interactions within that economy with respect to the preservation of the natural environment and the natural ecology. So if we all know about capitalism, how capitalism is kind of contradictory because the mode of production literally destroys a factor of production in labor or in land. And that's actually not even a Freudian slip, because capitalism does destroy labor as well, psychologically, medically, in so many different ways. But the territorial state in the African centered conception would not be the same, because land and ecology was very, very important. And I'm going to get into Walter Rodney's differentiation of African systems of production based upon those regions. So from the territorial state, you have the superstate. And again, on the side here, I have examples going back to the proto-state, the Emohag, which would be a branch of the Amazigh people of North Africa. And they can be found in Libya, in Niger, as well as Mauritania and other areas. Then you have a territorial state. So Mauritania, though it doesn't necessarily have the same formation of what our ancestors would describe, would be an example of that under the right constitutional reforms. Now, a superstate would be an interregional polity, like the Maghreb or the Sahel or the Sahara, right? So this is basically an interregional administrative unit that could consist of multiple territorial states, but they're unified in accordance to the demands of the natural environment, as well as the different formalities that they use to preserve those life, or to maintain those life preserving behaviors as opposed to life destroying behaviors. And then you have the pan state, and here I use in the Islamic world as an example. Christendom would be a Christian example of that. But if we're to think about, the Garveyite mission to establish a federation or to establish a polity to defend the descendants of Africa all over the world, an African United Federation would also be an example of a pan state. So that would basically be a identity or administrative unit or polity that's based upon a concept beyond what we can necessarily quantify through human endeavors, but it's more so connected to an ontology that's related to our origin as human beings, right? Or it's more so related to, you could say, a theological perception. You could say a certain
universal mission. But according to the research of Dr. Dika Aqua, all of these African states eventually would reach the pan state formation. And Kwame Ture actually spoke about that, where he said that a continental federation or an international pan African polity would be what our ancient pre colonial African civilizations would have evolved into if the Ma'afa had not taken place and if it had not stunted our evolution. So here we have some basic elements of civilization, and these elements are important because a lot of people, they question why there's so much of an emphasis on these Nile Valley civilizations. And one of the reasons for that is because of the preponderance of evidence. There's so much evidence for civilization in an African context on the Nile Valley. And the first civilizations to reach all of these parameters in court of organized writing systems, monumental architecture, systematic theology, high population density, urbanization, social stratification, and the development of a state was Kush and then Kimi. And then the later civilizations of West and Central Africa greatly benefited from the evolutionary processes that were established here on the Nile Valley. And this has been observed from the African centered perspective as well as from the mainstream perspective. There's a professor by the name of Christopher Ehret, and he basically came to these same conclusions by establishing what he called the commercial revolution. And according to his analysis, these Nile Valley civilizations were the first areas or the first cultures to reach what is considered now civilization. So right here we have some testimonies. We have some testimonies of different African people in Western and Central Africa speaking about their origins or their partial affiliation from the Nile Valley. And when I say partial affiliation, this is not necessarily to say that the entire corpus of their population came from the Nile Valley. It's more so saying that a dynastic lineage or a certain important operational guild, or maybe even a theogonic society originated there and gave them an important piece or important cultural element that led to the establishment of a state and a civilization within their particular region. And in this diagram to the right, you have these certain ethnicities, and this is compiled by Dr. Dika Aqua, and he relates these ethnicities back to what is called the Zagara or the Gara, which would be the Beriberi, if you're familiar with them in the Lake Chad area. And these Central Africans would be the ancestors of the majority of these lineages that we find in West Africa. And you have the Sangam tradition in Western Cameroon, articulated by Ibrahim Njoya, the Yerere traditions of the Soninke of Ghana, the Geseri Barusu tradition of the Songhai, the Euro Diao tradition of Senegambia, the Njedo Dawal tradition of the Fulani, the Korotumu Ba tradition of the Mande, Ejiomanta and Okoronkwo tradition of the Igbo, and the Awujali tradition of the Yoruba. And these are important because there are a lot of brothers and sisters who would state that, if you're trying to explain some partial affiliation from the Nile, this is rooted in Hamidicism, or more particularly, the Hamido-Semitic linguistic heritage. And that's not necessarily the case. That type of typology is more so rooted in an Abrahamic tradition, and it's more so connected to geopolitical inferences that these various oral historians and griots were making. Whereas if you look at the majority of the oral testimonies of the African continent, and this is also corroborated by Dr. Musa Lam, who we discussed earlier, they have an archaeolinguistic typology, and they basically corroborate with different information that we can find in other fields such as material culture and even genetics. So there's a lot of confirmation of these oral testimonies, and it would take a really, really long time to go into that research. But just a forewarning for those, I know there may be some brothers and sisters who are probably part of that scholastic idea. So this is another affiliation documented by Dika Aqua, and what he's dealing with is a conception of these African lineages, and I'm particularly focusing on West Africa here, from an African-centered perspective. And if you go back here, dealing with affiliation of the Gara and the Zagara. When you look at the Chadic people of Western Africa, autosomally, if you examine their autosomal genetic profile, they cluster close to so-called Nilo-Saharan people. The Barone people of the Middle Belt region, where the Yoruba and Igbo people say that they come from, they also cluster in that same direction. The Bamileke people of Western Cameroon, their autosomal profile clusters closer to Sudan than it does to the so-called Bantu populations. The Fulani of Western Africa, all the way into Senegambia, their autosomal genetic profile. And when I say autosomal, I'm speaking of not necessarily a father, father, father in the Y chromosome sense, or a mother, mother, mother in an mtDNA sense. I'm more so speaking on the majority of our genome in the mother's father's father's mother, the father's mother's father, father, et cetera, et cetera. So when we examine these Western African populations, another example is the Ewe people of Benin and the Akan people of Ghana. Their autosomal profile is clustering closer to the Omotic people, or the Oromo people, the Gala people of Ethiopia. These autosomal and genetic, this data validates a lot of these migratory testimonies. So in order to conceptualize the extension and evolution from the Nile Valley into Central and Western Africa, we have to deal with Meroe, or Meroe, as it is pronounced within the ancient language. And Meroe is important because it is one of the seats of the 25th dynasty in ancient Kimi. Now, when our ancestors on the Nile, or the Hapi, were invaded by the Persians, many of them settled into Central Africa, and they established a kingdom that is called Kanem. And Kanem was the seat of these Beriberi or Zagawa people. And from that seat, they established what is called the Wangara Inter-Empire. And if we can refer back to the superstate model in the cycles of state typology, the Wangara would be an example of a superstate or an interregional state. So from Wangara, you have Tagara in the Lake Chad area, Zagara in what is now the eastern portion of Western Africa from Niger to Nigeria, and then Ngalam extending into Senegambia. And as you can see here, based upon this chart, you can see where certain civilizations of Western Africa, such as the Sokoto, the Jolof, the Mali, Songhai Empire, where they basically descend from. And you also see right here in Simo in Central Africa, which would be kind of in the northern part of the Congo Basin. And then you have the Galanjam empires in the deeper part of the Congo Basin, where you're going to find the Kuba, Lunda, and Luba empires. So what we have right here in How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, Walter Rodney describes specific variations of the African mode of production in the continent. And he has the Remen-Kimi system in the Nile Valley, the Nubian system, the Ethiopian system, the Amazigh system of North Africa, the Oya River system, Oya being one of the original names for the Niger River Valley, the Interlacustrine Zone system of Central Africa, and the Zimbabwean system. And these systems followed a similar typology that was laid out by Cheikh Anta Diop. The only difference would be certain environmental conditions and parameters allowed them to develop specific distinctions. And one example of this is if you were to examine Sahelian civilizations, what you're going to find is that there is a taboo associated with iron metallurgy, right? And there is a relationship between the ruler of the civilization and the equestrian. Whereas in Central Africa, because of the preponderance of the tsetse fly, you don't necessarily see the equestrian being or holding such a prominent role. And at the same time, you see certain kings being associated with blacksmiths. So that's an example of, just different parallel evolutionary patterns that you can observe in Africa if you follow this particular model. So then you have a Senji Afan, a Cameroonian scholar, and he gave another analysis of African mode of production economies. And he observed the following elements in pre-colonial African economies: the virtual absence of class antagonisms, the absence of capital penetration in pre-colonial Africa. And by capital, we're talking about the secularization and the individualization of African mode of production surplus value. In the African mode of production economies, currencies had sociocultural and ecological significance, in that surplus value was collectivized and redistributed to the less fortunate. So you didn't necessarily have homeless people walking around, or what you may call vagabonds. You had people trying to look out for each other and protect each other and make sure everybody was okay. So these currencies, again, they had social cultural significance dedicated to the public good and ecological conservation rather than surplus. And in this model, use value was always denominated more than the exchange value. In capitalism, it's the opposite. And these currencies were structurally closer to pure energy because they didn't exist on a capital circuit. They were more so commodity equivalents. So you had gold, you had silver, you had certain metallurgical items. And after they were traded within an exchange, they reverted to being a commodity. So they were no longer currencies that you could trade money per money type of transactions. And macroeconomically, these currencies were utilized for sectoral productivity. So that's basically establishing sectoral balances. Say there was never a situation where maybe the economy was doing well, but people psychologically were doing horribly. Or in a particular economy, if you had fishery systems doing well and housing doing bad, or if you had the transportation system doing well, but the agricultural system doing bad. You didn't have that. Whenever you had a sectoral imbalance, in most situations, the managers of these pre-colonial African economies did their best to make sure every part of the economy was in equilibrium. And you had full employment. So there was never a situation where you couldn't or there was nothing to do and you basically couldn't sustain yourself to survive. Within all of these African traditions, they had distinct formalities to make sure that every man and woman was being put to use to maintain their society. And you had food security. Again, type of hunger was not a thing that we saw within our ancient economies. And this is what happens when you build and construct an economy with the ecology as a factor of production into consideration, as opposed to the modern exploitative economy when profit is basically the god over everything. So, as an example of some of the institutional systems that we had in Dahomey, you had cowrie storage houses called a quejo, and then money holders were housed in them to protect them. They had systems of zero interest loans, and the cowries were stored in the homes of wealthy neighbors for security. So these are some of the four major elements of Osenjiafana's AMP analysis. You have jus sanguinis, or citizenship by the way of lineage or affiliation. And I must add a caveat to that because there are many situations in pre-colonial Africa where they had adoption, meaning that you could be adopted into a society if you followed the protocols of that particular society. And there was an absence of direct intervention by the state. So while you did have centralization for a variety of themes like currency, land, et cetera, there were other associations more so connected to what we may call the deep state, and that's point three. And you had a gerontocracy, or rulership by the elders, in the sense that elders were respected. So having eldership was connected to leadership. If you followed the particular protocols of the society and you were of good use to the society, in the sense that you use your wisdom to develop those around you. You have countermeasures against corruption, as I discussed before. And this is an example of that on the right here. This is the Kwasi society among the Bamileke of Western Cameroon. And they are designed to keep the Mvun, or the ruler, in check, in that every 2 years they have a festival and they can either impeach the Mvun or keep him around. And that is also connected, if you're familiar with the Sed Festival in classical Africa and ancient Kimi, related to kingship and the rejuvenation or rebirth of the king. And if you want to go even deeper than that, then you could say that that is literally where they formulated the first Christmas celebrations in North Africa. So you also have social life regulated by public opinion, customs, and traditions. So it's not necessarily, again, direct intervention from the state, but you more so have cultural regulations on a local level and families getting together to make sure that you are in good form. And if you're not, there's other protocols such as banishment and just different punishments, punitive measures to make sure everything is squared away. So right here you have the Oba as a servant. In the Dahomey conception, all wealth of the nation belonged to the king. The citizens enjoyed the Oba's wealth for temporary usage. Upon the decease of an elder, the wealth of an estate was seized, deducted, and then granted to the rightful heir. So all private wealth is a loan from the treasury. And under this formality, it was a way that our ancestors used economic security, or that they maintained economic security, in the sense that the job of the Oba was to be a good steward of the wealth of the nation, and he was meant to be extremely generous, in the sense that if there were poor people without homes, if there was a widow, it was his job to make sure that they were taken care of. And again, if you're familiar with Cheikh Anta Diop's research, there was a periodical ritual death of the Oba, meaning that there are people within the lay societies or the deep state institutions that would do rituals and sometimes actual um, killings of these Obas if they were too corrupt, to make sure that the integrity of the society remained intact. So these were not all powerful, like ministers of truth. If I were to use a George Orwell example, 1984, these were leaders with strength and centralization, but their power was directed towards the progress of the greater society. Now, these are elements of the African marketplace compiled by Paul Alfred Barton's analysis of pre-colonial susus. So you have mandatory wealth reserves, right? So families, locales, regions, even nations themselves were required to have what we now call sovereign wealth funds. You have the obligation to strengthen cultural ties. That's very, very important because most of the different interregional alliances or pleasantries that our ancestors used were based upon cultural and ancestral commonalities. You have products that are a reflection of personal character and must be manufactured to perfection. So you didn't have this planned obsolescence that you see in this modern economy, because in pre-colonial African systems, if you sold a product that was spoiled, that was a reflection of your bad character and a bad character of your family and lineage. So customers must be found among the trustworthy, and the vendor must serve the customer. So again, you didn't have these tricky sales, things that they did to try to get you to spend money that you didn't have or exploit you. It was more so the vendor's responsibility to serve those trustworthy customers that they found. So again, as we discussed previously, you have the collectivization of resources, work, and time to build infrastructure for ecological preservation. And you have the responsibility to make sure that every family was taken care of. So these are just some principles of African property management from Eleanor Ostrom. And this goes back to what I was talking about before when I dealt with the common pool of resources in African land tenure. And land tenure was distributed in clearly defined boundaries with effective exclusion of external unentitled parties. So there was a congruence between the resource environment and its governing structure. And again, that goes back to the ecological conservation. All of these economic decisions were made with the environment in consideration. So you wouldn't have a plastic island the size of Texas in the Atlantic Ocean. That wouldn't be a possibility within the African-centered mode of production. You have decisions that are made through collective choice arrangements that allow most resource appropriators to participate, and the rules are enforced through effective monitoring by monitors who are part of or accountable to the appropriators. Violators are punished through graduated sanctions. Conflicts and issues are addressed with low cost and easy to access conflict resolution mechanisms. Higher level authorities recognize the right of the resource appropriators to self-govern. And in the case of a larger common pool of resources, rules are organized and enforced through multiple layers of nested enterprise. And that's going back to the lay societies or the deep state institutions that we referred to before. So Okoth Agendo, and this is a Kenyan scholar, he defines African land tenure as an inverted pyramid, where the family is the first decision maker, the clan lineage serves the family, and then the community serves the clan. So here, land access is more important than private ownership. And that's because the use value is always more important than the exchange value. So in this context, you wouldn't necessarily have a real estate industry where vacant land is literally sitting there for the maximum profit. Instead, you had land that was used for the maximum economic and productive utility. And that ends my presentation. And I know it was a little bit brief and super surface level, but if we want to go a little bit deeper, if anybody has any questions, we can definitely go into that. I think you're muted.
Okay. I wanted to make sure you were still there. Make sure I removed the right screen. But brilliant presentation, man. There's definitely people in the chat was appreciating all the information that you were bringing. There was a couple of questions. I put the link to the StreamYard. I put the link to the StreamYard in the chat. If anyone wants to join the conversation, have some questions, click on the StreamYard link, and I'll bring you up. There was a couple of questions by Sith Lord. You can come up, Sith Lord, and ask the question yourself if you want. But that was brilliant, man. First thing before I go into those questions, I wanted to, I wish you had like a reference page, man. You want to talk about some of those books? You named some great scholars, but some book recommendations maybe for people who are interested in further.
Oh yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of my resources aren't in English, but I'll try to name off some English ones. So Walter Rodney, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, is extremely important, especially within the modern day of these diaspora wars and all this craziness, because it shows that the general narrative of Africans selling Africans is absolutely false. And capitalism, the global capitalist system, was built based upon the enslavement of our ancestors. So that's a really, really important text. And I would say that Civilization or Barbarism, or The African Origin of Civilization, is also a great text to start out with, because it's going to show you some of the distinctions between our pre-colonial African economies and the economies of, say, the Eurasian world. So those like seminal texts for me, that's kind of how I got started on this journey. And then, looking at the resources and just the different scholars that they referenced. And then I got into deeper analysis just to figure out and understand all of these distinctions. So those would be the main text that I would recommend.
Appreciate that. And hey, peace, comrade.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah, we got you.
All right, good.
Peace.
Peace is really good. Excuse me. That you're all having this discussion. I was actually on my way, to go to sleep, right? And I just jumped on, and I was like, "Wow, this is really great." So I just want to first of all just say thank you. I know it takes a lot of time, right, to compile such great research, but you really had me had my gears really thinking a whole lot when you're talking about just the historical development of African societies and the ways in which we've been like miseducated, even some of us on the left too, right? Like, about those things. So I'm really appreciative of the ways in which you kind of balance out some of the things of which Karl Marx brings a critique on in terms of capital, but you really try to do, at least what I got from it is the ways in which you open up a possibility, at least for some of us who are revolutionary and also who are on the left, to start taking on organizing our production around socialist means, but with an African characteristics. And I think that that's something maybe across the Black left that we need to really organize ourselves around. I think sometimes we spend too much time trying to figure out if we're so white thinking about our experiences because we, refer to things of Marx and things like that. Whereas our intellectual ancestors have already given us a platform to build off on. And I really think that your presentation today was a really good synthesis of that. So one of the questions that I really asked, right? So how do you think that we should approach looking at some of the principles that guided the way that our people had developed themselves? And now we find ourselves in the age of a racial regime under, imperialism and things like that. So, I don't know. I was just like, how do we take these principles and these practices, right? Mm-hmm. And then how does that translate into a politics within Black working class communities? One book that really had me thinking about a lot of what you're talking about is by Cedric Robinson, this book called Terms of Order. And so he really kind of talks about the ways in which Black people historically organize themselves outside of the lens of Eurocentricity and things like that into a more almost like an anarchistic way, right? The whole idea of order is something that isn't really kind of all the way familiar with African societies, because there's many African societies that don't even organize themselves as states. And so what he says is that this is principle of kinship, right? Mm-hmm. And so sometimes I wonder, what kind of politics can be formed and the ways that we build with one another off of that. Loaded question.
Yeah.
But yeah, my bad. Like,
No,
but
it's
yeah.
perfect.
Okay,
It's a perfect question, and I'll say that I have a particular unique experience in the sense that I discovered the left at a really young age. I remember reading Capital in 7th grade and being really fascinated with it. And I always said that, and that's a really brilliant comment in the sense that the left and the right is a European paradigm and worldview, and our paradigm is more so about liberation versus being enslaved. So there's obviously going to be principles that Marx is correct about. In the same way that when he builds upon Adam Smith and David Hume, some of these Enlightenment philosophers who came before him, he's kind of building a scientific analysis on that foundation. So, to answer your question, our ancestors, such as Edward Wilmot Blyden and Alexander Crummell and Africanus Horton, they articulated this very brilliantly, where they spoke about the multiple consciousness and how we exist within different registers. We have a Black register, we have the African descendant register, our register as so-called American citizens, which would be more so denizens. And the idea of an intelligent organization is being able to get the best of both worlds and being able to benefit from, say, a business class, or benefit from, say, a theological class, or benefit from, say, an organizational leadership class. And to me, my analysis, you both have the beautiful red, black, and green behind you. And when I study Marcus Garvey, I don't necessarily study him from the capitalist perspective. I disagree with the opinion that he was a capitalist, because the auxiliaries of the UNIA were organized like horizontally managed cooperatives with men and women at the helm, as opposed to the patriarchy of the West. But Marcus Garvey told us to do for Africa what Lenin and Tolstoy did for Russia. And when I say that quote, if you recognize the UNIA as a provisional government, or an African analog to the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, or what we may call the Bolsheviks, that is literally the blueprint that we could use to organize a revolutionary type of federation to meet the needs that we may have on these different levels. Now, in order to articulate that from a practical level, obviously it's going to start at different areas. So I don't know about I know that Dr. Akemba is a professor, right? And Dr. Akemba's job is to make sure that the next generation is elevated. So the way that he exists within organizations is to literally plant seeds within the brains of future builders. In my case, I'm an engineer, and full disclosure, I work for the man, as many people do work for the man. But in this environment, I'm bringing forth my talents to change the perspective of people within this space, to build further institutions and organizations. So, long story short, to answer your question, and to build on the very last thing that you said in terms of kinship, yes, we do not necessarily create kinfolk bonds based upon the way that the man, or the Yurugu, if I'm able to use that term, does it. Right? Dika Aqua, the scholar that I mentioned previously, he actually outlined 6 parameters of kinship in pre-colonial African economies. There's the biological kinship based on blood ties, reference to a common ancestor; residential kinship in village or community; matrimonial kinship, or making a household a group from kinship or the birth of a child or a marital union; totem kinship proceeding from the division of work; ontological kinship, those who we consider human beings, animals, objects, or connected in essence; and then there's cosmic kinship, which cuts across horizontally ontological kinship and proceeds by deduction of beings and objects from a divinity. So if we understand that, we understand that there's so many different possibilities into how we can organize, and we shouldn't limit ourselves by what we see within the Eurocentric world.
Fantastic. I'm like finishing my doctoral program, so like you're giving me way more energy out here. Thanks again, and thank you all for this great public discourse around stuff that really matters. And I feel like this is the beginning of trying to form our own political theory as a people. So this is great work. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you for coming on.
No problem.
Yes, thank you. I want to second that. Great question, great response too. That doctoral program, I got excited when he said that. Me fresh out the program.
Yeah, I'm trying to apply to one myself, and it's been kind
on.
of it's been kind of an uphill battle because, as you know, the politics can be crazy sometimes, and sometimes you can step in and you're like, this isn't for me. So I've had a few situations like that, but I'm still searching for the right program.
Yeah, that's what it is. It's about finding the right fit for you, and making sure that you're going to be able to do what it is that you want to do.
Yeah,
when you get in there.
Absolutely. And I always say, like, if you you follow me on Clubhouse, so you know that the moniker is RBG Engineer, right? So I always say that even though, like, I can find myself in these crazy spaces with all of these hyper intellectuals, like, being centered and like maintaining your core principles is so important, super important. So that's what I would say, like, for all the brothers and sisters out there, like, whatever you do, like, make sure that you try your absolute hardest to maintain that center.
Absolutely. And everybody that's viewing, make sure that you subscribe to Kamjiverse. And
please.
You have a lot of content up there. I didn't even know you had. How long have you been doing it? Because when I went on there, I'm like, man, it looked like you've been here for a while.
Yeah, I've been on and off. Like, I actually started a page. I've had multiple pages. Like, my first page was like 5-6 years ago, and I was doing more so like content connected to history, but I didn't necessarily have all the tools that I needed in the sense of, I researched more pre-colonial African history, and most people obviously in the Americas are coming from a diasporic perspective. So there were some things that I was missing and research that, I needed. And I've spoken to, Dr. Jahi Issa, and he gave me a lot of different tools and pointers to, like, stay away from Wilson Jeremiah Moses' propaganda and read Sterling Stuckey. And, just some of the good grounding that I have now, I got from him. So I deleted that one, and then I started one about like 3 years ago. I did some trial runs, made some videos on and off, deleted some, and now this current iteration has been about, I think, 8 or 9 months, if I'm not mistaken. So, yeah. Peace.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to reiterate what the brother said earlier about the fact that, like, the information that you're sharing is really powerful. And I mean, it's greatly uncommon for us to be hearing like the level of scholarship that you presenting, as well as a level of detail that could give us a more concrete idea of like how our past and our ancestors like more realistically function, thought, and how we were found by the European. And the kind of questions that I wanted to ask, I think maybe like 2 or 3. One was, based on what you have presented today, because you kind of touched on it real briefly, but how does that impact the discussion of?
I think you cut off.
Hey, Pete, you cut out. Mr. Aston, can you hear us? Yeah, he had cut out.
Maybe I think it's connection, or maybe some dropped.
Yeah.
Hold on.
Oh, there we go.
There he is.
All right, I apologize. I don't know where I dropped off, bro, but the first question that I wanted to ask y'all was the idea of slave trading or enslavement in Africa. I know that it's connected to the idea of prisoners of war, right?
Yeah.
And I also know that in that practice, there's a practice of sort of absorbing somebody into your population to increase the size of your population.
Mm-hmm.
But then the relationship between, I believe specifically some individuals and the Arabs then changes how that begins to function based on the Abrahamic tradition and how they and their introduction of anti-blackness into that, and how they then begin to practice, I guess, transacting at that point with, you know, non-Abrahamic Africans for prisoners of war, I guess. So like, basically, right now we have that whole reparations discussion, and there's this whole idea that's becoming more and more heavily popularized about, the Africans sold us, right? And so what is like the clear line of a logic to look
Mhm.
at the real reality that was happening?
Yeah, I would say that we have to understand the enslavement process as a European enterprise. That's what most of our scholars have demonstrated, that it was a enterprise that was controlled from top to bottom by European powers. And most of these reparations groups are grifters in the sense that, and I'm not saying like the legitimate Pan Africanist organizers and organizations who are fighting for reparations. They're obviously legitimate, but more so speaking about these various acronym groups who are combining like American nativism with the idea of reparations for chattel slavery. I wouldn't listen to any of them. They make you more dumber than you came by listening to them. And I would more so listen to John Henry Clark. Eric Williams has a book called Capitalism and Slavery where he expands on that research. Walter Rodney talks about it as well. And the general principle is that, yeah, you were correct in stating that in the original African conception, these were more so indentured servants. These were not people who were enslaved based upon race or subspeciation. They were not people who were enslaved, for life. They had rights of enfranchisement. I could think of one example of the Bamileke in Western Cameroon and the Bamoun, where Nguhu, he was a Bamileke servant of the Bamoun, and he rose to become the Mvan, or the ruler. And there's a variety of examples of that where so-called slaves became rulers of the societies. Now, if you can think of an example where an African slave became the president, let me know. But logic says that that never happened. So it obviously wasn't the same type of enfranchisement. And you're also correct in the sense of the Abrahamic factor, but that is more so of a complicated, nuanced conversation because those Abrahamic traditions did influence through external pressures the evolution of our matrifocal systems to more so patrilineal systems. But at the same time, you have certain Africans following Abrahamic traditions, Kimpavita in Congo, Abdul Qadir Khan, Al-Mami Abdul Qadir Khan in Futatoro in the 18th century, who was a Muslim leader who abolished enslavement in Senegambia against the plight of the British who wanted to set up cotton plantations, right? So you have many examples of Africans using these traditions as vehicles for liberation. So it's more of a both and proposition. But I would say that the preponderance of evidence, particularly from scholars like Sylviane Diouf, who documents the resistance to slavery and particularly references some of the infrastructural systems, such as those developed in northern Cameroon among the Mandara to resist slavery, it shows that the overwhelming majority of people on the African continent were resistance to the Ma'afa and the chattelization. And I'll end off on this last point, right? And this is a very, very important thing. Most continental Africans descend from those who were enslaved. And let me paint a picture. If you were an African man, let's say that you're in your 40s, and let's say that you have some children on the African continent, and you're captured into slavery, and you're sold into the Americas, what happens to your children? They grow up and they have kids, and those kids stay on the African continent, and then they have children, and then the generations go on and on and on. So if you were to look at the filiation of most Africans on the continent, you would see that they had ancestors who were trafficked into slavery. Now, that's not to minimize the unique experience of Africans in the diaspora, because there is definitely a unique experience, but it's to coordinate it within the direction of a Pan-African project. Because even today, AFRICOM is oppressing African nations. You have a variety of different impositions from the intelligentsia and different factors on the African continent against resource autonomy. One of those being in Zimbabwe in relation to lithium, as well as Burkina Faso, Mali, and Guinea with the coups against these Western-backed dictators. So bottom line is we can't do this without one another. And the stronger we are and the more leverage that we have on an international level, the more likely that reparations will be delivered to all of us.
Thank you, bro. I got one additional question. It's quick, right?
Sure.
Do you think that it is a um, realistic, I guess, project to try to de-Westernize like our politic and to like re-Africanize it based on like the complexity of what you already like? Because you've basically described something that's like very advanced, egalitarian. It's most of what we trying to aspire to right now.
Yeah.
So can we just like go back into that and reclaim it, or are we too far westernized to approach it that way?
I'd say that's where Dr. Akemba comes in as an educator and a teacher. Education is extremely important because it changes the trajectory of the next generation. So if we have institutions that are based upon supplying the necessary resources to our educators and our pedagogical institutions, that's when you're going to see the change of Westernization versus Africanization. So I would say firmly and affirmatively that without a strong, robust African centered education system, it is absolutely impossible to Africanize our population and get them prepared for these type of formalities that we would have in an African centered economy.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Kemba, and thank you to We Charge Colonialism. This is one of the. I mean, I came here from Black Power Media,
Mm,
and Black Power Media I enjoy a lot, but listening to this gives me like a different perspective on a lot of the information that is shared in Black Power Media as well. You know, it adds to it.
yeah.
And so, you know, I think we charge colonialism as a platform too. And I think you as a scholar and Dr. Kemba as an educator. Thank you.
Thank you for
Thank
coming
you.
on.
Yeah, appreciate you. Yeah, Black Power Media. I was on. I was watching Black Power Media this morning. Yeah, make sure y'all subscribe to Black Power Media. This goes back to what you're saying in regards to education. Like we have platforms. We need the schools as well, right?
Yeah.
And like when I do my research is in, I'm looking at colonial education in
Hmm.
Sierra Leone, particularly the American missions, but I look at the British schools as well.
Hmm.
Well, one thing I learned in my research is the importance of educating children to be able to uh, educate the next generation to carry out your objectives, your mission, and
Absolutely.
yeah, and that's what was going on.
Yeah.
To be able to, the elder, it was hard for them to educate people who were a certain age, and one thing that they did that we should keep in mind, particularly I'm talking about Sierra Leone, but
Hmm.
you probably see this in other places too, is that they began to take the children from the communities and put them in, or from their community and put them in boarding schools,
Yeah.
because when they were educating them, the children were going back to their community, and they would still, they'd be absorbed in their own culture. So it was hard for them to acculturate these children as a
Mm.
result of that. So they would take these children away from their quote unquote tribes. But that just shows the importance of education. But yeah, yeah.
And I to build upon that, most of our revolutionaries, whether you're talking about Lumumba in Congo, Ernest Owanji in Cameroon, Samuel Njoma in Namibia, or even Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, they got a lot of their revolutionary ideas from a Western education system in the same process that you laid out. So
Mhm.
there were many situations where they were given the choice to either take the side of the beast or to take the side of liberation. And the ones that we read about today took the side of liberation. So it
Mhm.
speaks to the reality of what we were laying out before in the sense of maintaining our center. Because if it wasn't for the Mareed education that, Sheikh Anta Diop got from lay societies in Senegambia, he probably wouldn't have, embarked on the mission to get a doctorate degree in Egyptology in Europe. So even though we come to these institutions that are not controlled by us, or we don't have the autonomy, it doesn't mean that we can't develop revolutionary strategies to navigate through the milieu and come out on top.
Appreciate that. I just posted this question: how do the Bantu and Gunu races spread out in the South? Do they come out of Kemet too? Um,
I would say that I caution, I would caution the brothers and sisters out there from using, classifications like Bantu, because they're based upon the multilateral comparative method, and they're not necessarily a scientifically established language group. So I start there when we deal with these different themes. But
so what?
Go ahead.
I would say go ahead. You can address. Well, before you address the question, just because of the Bantu, what you said about the Bantu, because the Bantu is a term used by Europeans, right?
Absolutely.
To describe groups of people. So what was the basis for them to say that these, like, what was the common thread that they seen, if any, to say, oh, these people are the Bantu, to describe these people as Bantu? You get what I'm saying? It's because I'm pretty sure.
Yeah.
It's like even classifying Africans as African.
Yeah.
Where there's that diversity, but the European on the outside looking at, all Africans look the same.
Yeah, the whole true Negro idea that they use to discount African civilizations and the development of so-called Black Caucasians. It's coming from the Hamitic theory, or the Hamiticist theory, that white pastoralists from West Asia civilized the African continent. And it's deeply linked to apartheid, because the establisher of Bantu, Wilhelm Bleek, he was a student of Karl Lepsius, who was a German ethnologist and linguist. He was the founder of Hamiticist linguistics. So when Europeans established Bantu, and Khoisan is another problematic classification established by Leonhard Schultz, another German linguist and scholar, they were trying to justify apartheid. And the main idea in Southern Africa that they were trying to relate was the fact that these so-called Bantu people displaced the quote unquote First Nations of South Africa in the Khoisan, right? But as I stated before, there's not really such thing as a Khoisan. If you go to South Africa today, you'll find people who refer to be called Koena and San as related but distinct groups. So the classification, in and of itself is based upon colonialism, and it's invalid. But there is some truth to what I don't remember the brother's name, but there is some truth to what he was saying. If you examine the lactase persistence gene that a lot of these pastoralists in Southern and Central Africa have, and that's the lactase persistence 14010C, and that does come from Eastern Africa, and that does come from the area of Ethiopia and Sudan. So there are some mainstream scholars who do believe and who do affirm the idea that it was Southern Cushitic speaking populations related to Somalis who existed on the Nile Valley, who migrated in what's called the Savannah Pastoral Neolithic from about 3000 BCE to 700 of the Common Era. And they spread down that area, what's called the Nderit, the Nderit, Nderit, or stone bowl culture, stone bowl taphonomy related to burial traditions. And this pastoral Neolithic complex started in Eastern Africa along the Nile Valley and then spread down into Central and Southern Africa. So when Nguni and these different populations among the Zulu and the Xhosa articulate Bakushi ancestry, there is archaeogenetic evidence to corroborate those testimonies.
Hey, appreciate that. Hey, we're going to come to a close in a few, but I want to, if there's anything that you want to tell the people in regards to where to follow you outside of like YouTube, you definitely subscribe to Conjiverse.
Yeah.
The description is in the link. So make sure you click on that, subscribe. Is there any other information or ways people can follow you that you want to?
You can subscribe, please. I just got some reports on, about a little less than 8% of my viewers are subs to my channel. So, if you come by and you watch, subscribe and share. I don't really have any other platforms just yet because I'm trying to build out my channel a little bit more. But when I do, in my about page, I'm gonna post like other things like Twitter, Instagram, Cash App for the content and everything. But right now, a subscribe is gonna help me a long way. So I really would appreciate if the family did that.
That's what's up. Y'all heard that. And plus, hey, the information that you're putting out, you know, we need to make sure we support this brother so he can continue putting out this information. You know, this is
Yes,
you know,
it's difficult.
you're a think tank in yourself, brother. Like we're a think tank, but you're a think tank in yourself. So we got to make sure we're supporting this brother. Again, I want to appreciate you for taking the time out too and doing this. We have to bring you back, brother.
Absolutely. I'm going to come back. And I'm also on Son Netter's channel, like his House of Consciousness channel.
Okay.
I've been on there a few times, so you can catch me there, you know, every now and then. But
Right
yeah,
on.
anytime you want to bring me on, because I'm really, really into the debate between, you know, some Marxists and some Garveyites about what is the best revolutionary platform. So I'm open to those types of panel discussions, or even just if you want to have a conversation about what to do in the contemporary political world, I would be really, really open to that as well.
Yeah, for sure. And you know, and I want to encourage people too, like whatever ideas that we have in regards to forming, we should be forming systems that are counter the establishment, the political economy that's dominating us, colonial capitalism. But there's things that we need to be doing with our families. We can start the model
Absolutely.
with our family, you know, and then take
Absolutely.
that to the community. So, you know, whatever ideas you have, if you can organize that with the people that's closest to you, then you know we'll be on our way to disrupting this system, dismantling the system for sure.
For sure. For sure.
All right. With that being said, you know, again, appreciate you. Appreciate everybody for tuning in and watching. Continue to check out, of course, like this 10 a.m. This Saturday at 10 a.m. Nkrumah and Conscientism. We're finishing up the book.
I
So
love
10
that
a.m.
book.
Eastern time. Yeah. Hey, I've been struggling with my comrades because the way that Nkrumah, his writing style, you know, it's tough, you know.
I love it for the concepts. I love it for the liberation concepts and the equations and all that. That's my type of stuff as an engineer.
Yeah, I love Nkrumah.
Yeah,
But
he's
yeah,
the
this
best.
Saturday at 10 a.m. Again, appreciate y'all, man. Peace.
Peace.